As you'll see, this is a 4-part webinar series kicking off today over the next month. I'm Nandini Hampol with Bregal Investments and co-lead with Thomas Carlier at Investment Industrial of the ICI-led Scope 3 Decarbonisation Working Group in collaboration with several other private markets companies or firms, which Thomas is going to introduce in just a minute. The experts at Baringa Partners really will shepherd the discussion alongside a case study from a private equity-backed business, Guala Closures Group from Paolo, also today. Just to briefly introduce the session, essentially to decarbonize the global economy, there's really an urgent need that all actors in the rail economy need to reduce their GHG emissions at really a sufficient rate to align with the Paris Agreement's goals. Scope 3 emissions or value chain related emissions are over 11 times higher or 11.4 times to be perfectly precise per the CDP, higher than your own direct operational emissions. And what we'll learn throughout the webinar series, which will be recorded, is that we will welcome private market leads and companies really to learn about Scope 3 emissions, the value of engaging with your value chain partners to reduce emissions impact overall. So with that, over to Thomas at Investment Industrial.
Thanks, Nandini, and I'm very excited to launch this webinar series with you and Baringa today. So just a few words on the ICI, so Initiative Climat International, and the ICI Scope 3 Decarbonisation Group. By the way, we know it's a very long name for a working group, so we are working on that. The ICI is a global practitioner-led community of private equity firms and investors that seek to better understand and manage the risks associated with climate change. We are to date 236 members, representing a combined 3 trillion assets under management. The ICI Scope 3 Decarbonisation Group is one of the many ICI groups made of a dozen of PE firms, and you can see the logos of the PE firms who are parts of the group on this slide, in addition to the PRI and series. Our goal is really to develop practical tools for our teams and our portfolio companies to reduce their Scope 3 emissions. And I'm quite happy to see that today quite a lot of our portfolio companies are actually connected to the webinar. This webinar series is the first output of our group, and we just kicked off a second work stream to develop a practical playbook for portfolio companies to reduce their Scope 3. We got the amazing support from Baringa for this webinar, so over to you, Ivan.
Thanks. So I think we just go on to the next slide. This is an overview, as Nandini mentioned. This is the first in sort of a series of webinars that we're doing. Today we're talking about what Scope 3 emissions are. In the next webinar, we're talking about how you collect that data. Then the third webinar, we're saying, okay, now that you've got the data, how do you set a target for Scope 3? And then the last webinar is once you have a target, how do you go about actually achieving that target? So we go on to the next slide. I'll pass over to Emily to talk about a little bit about Baringa.
Hi, so thank you ICI for providing us with the opportunity to work together on this important topic of Scope 3 emissions, and absolutely delighted that so many of you have been able to join us today. I'm Emily Fairmont, I lead Sustainable Capital and Transactions at Baringa. And who are we? Very briefly, we're a global management consultancy of over 2,000 people with 150 partners. We typically compete with the MBBs and Big Four, but we're expertise-led and cover all sectors. We're a single P&L, and why is that important? It means that as a business, we're able to collaborate across all sectors to help solve complex sustainability-related challenges, such as Scope 3 emissions. We're also the largest consultancy that's a B Corp, which is really, really important to us as a business. I'm delighted to say we've got Evan and Hugh with us today, both from Baringa, as well as some of the Baringa team have helped to pull together this webinar, and they're going to lead us through the content today. So over to you.
Thanks, Emily. So specifically what we'll be talking about today is the first part of the first part of the webinar, we're going to talk about sort of what does it mean to align Scope 3 emissions with Paris. We'll then go through a deep dive into sort of what Scope 3 emissions actually are, which he will lead. And then we'll talk about how you calculate your Scope 3 emissions before going into a case study. We talk about really putting some of this into practice, and specifically what it means for a company to have measured its Scope 3 emissions and to set a target. And then we will save some time at the end, because every time we've had these sorts of webinars, there are lots of questions. So we'll save some time at the end to go through some questions. So with that, let's kick off. So going on to the next slide, just a little bit of context about why this is so important. So as probably a lot of people on this call know, it's incredibly important that we keep the global temperatures to not rise above 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Once we start going above 1.5 degrees, we start to have irreversible climate damage. This isn't necessarily about saying we're being net zero. This is just about saying global temperatures can't rise above 1.5 to avoid that irreversible environmental damage. And aligning to 1.5 degrees, as that is typically called, is going to require a significant amount of investment in low carbon technologies, scaling and becoming more energy efficient, changing the way that our businesses operate, in addition to the policies that governments are coming out with. And that will then help us to make sure that we're not adding more carbon into the atmosphere than we're able to accommodate and not have irreversible damage. So moving on to the next slide, we want to talk a little bit before we get into the details of Scope 3 about the difference between carbon neutral and net zero. This is a topic that we hear a lot of people talking about, and it can sometimes be a little bit confusing. So you might have seen a lot of companies coming out with carbon neutral targets. You see a lot of companies that are putting a stamp on saying we're carbon neutral. Specifically, what being carbon neutral means is that the emissions that your business produce are offset in some way. So you're not adding additional emissions because you're offsetting them. Typically, when people are talking about carbon neutral, they're talking about Scope 1 and Scope 2. And Scope 3 is something that's encouraged, but not necessarily recommended. And then there are various ways that you're creating that balance between the emissions that you produce and how it's being offset. Net zero is something that's very different. Net zero means that you're aligning your operations to that temperature score, to that 1.5 degree trajectory. So like I mentioned before, in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we need to limit to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Net zero always includes Scope 3, and it has very specific requirements about how you're actually removing carbon. But with that, we really wanted to go into Scope 3. So looking at the next slide, today we're talking about Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are all of the indirect emissions that your company is producing. So emissions that come not from your operations, but from the value chain. So we're going to talk a lot about sort of upstream, downstream emissions. What does that mean? Who are we engaging with, to really help make this concept a bit clearer? Because Scope 3 emissions are often the most difficult topic to get your head around, because they're not the emissions that your business is actually producing. By managing and reporting your Scope 3 emissions, you can avoid sort of some risks, because we're certainly seeing lots of companies that are being impacted by incoming regulations, such as CSRD in Europe, or the Credible Transition Plan Task Force in the UK. But also, it's not all just about complying with regulation. It's important to think about Scope 3 as giving opportunities. By thinking about Scope 3 and your value chain, it means that you're able to engage and have really meaningful conversations, often with your suppliers and ultimately your customers, about how you go on this journey. So with that, we're going to go into a bit more detail about what Scope 3 emissions are, and I'll pass over to Hugh.
Thanks, Evan. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, you'll all have heard of it, I'm sure. It's the most widely used greenhouse gas accounting standard in existence. It's pretty much the foundation for almost all greenhouse gas accounting that you see, and underpins a lot of. There's various bits of guidance out there about how to apply it, but typically it sits at the heart of most people's emissions reporting, and indeed is referred to increasingly in a lot of the new regulation around emissions accounting and emissions reporting. It's been around a while. It was convened in 1998 by two not-for-profits, the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And they've been maintaining it and adding it and evolving it ever since and developing some sector-specific guidance around it. But I'll just take you through a few of the basic elements and some of the features and benefits of it. So firstly, the whole purpose of it when they set this up was to enable companies to measure, to manage and report their emissions from both their operations and crucially their value chains, which is where Scope 3 comes in. And that was a relatively new concept at the time, but very, very important. And having that data helps companies and organizations and governments and cities and all sorts of people to design their climate mitigation goals, to assess and report their progress against those goals, and to estimate the greenhouse gas emissions of policies and actions and investments and everything that goes on around that. So in addition to that kind of foundational document that was published back in the 90s, there's lots of addendums to that now in terms of how to interpret it and how to apply it, for example, in developing policies. So there's a whole range of greenhouse gas protocol documents out there. But that key document is the first one published, and that's still sort of the Bible that most people refer to when they start the process of measuring their emissions. The main benefits from it, well, it helps people identify those emissions that are really relevant to their business and over which they have, a fair degree of influence, and ensures that, companies are creating a complete inventory of their emissions. They really have a comprehensive view of the emissions associated with their business and their activities, that it's consistent and comparable with other companies, although I'll come to that in a second because that's a little bit of an issue, particularly around Scope 3, is that consistency, and that they bring transparency and accuracy to their measurement. So in theory, it's all wonderful, but I think particularly when it comes to Scope 3, because there's so much variability, because everybody's business is different, and how this is applied to everybody's difference can be interpreted differently. You don't always get that consistency and transparency and comparability that you'd like. But that's one of the challenges of using this across such a broad range of sectors, a broad range of businesses. Let's dive into it a little bit deeper. If we move on to the next slide, I'll talk you through some of the kind of basics of the corporate standard. So again, you'll probably all have heard of Scope 1, 2, and 3. And just to make sure that everybody's on the same page and has the same understanding. So Scope 1 is the simplest one, right? These are your direct emissions from your activities, right? In terms of your personal activities, most of us, certainly in my life, most of my direct emissions are probably the emissions from the exhaust in my car when I burn petrol in the engine, or the emissions from the gas boiler that heats my home. And really, that's it for me. I don't really burn any fossil fuels anywhere else, nor do I have any other activities that release greenhouse gas emissions. For businesses, that's largely the same. Most businesses burn something, be it fuel to heat their buildings or fuel in furnaces in their processes if they're industrial operation. But they may also have activities that involve chemical processes that release fugitive emissions into the atmosphere. Or if you're a coal miner and you're mining a coal seam, you'll get fugitive emissions that are released when you dig up that coal. Methane will escape from pockets under the earth. And that will all be the direct emissions arising from their activities. So that's your Scope 1. It's the most easy to estimate. It's the most easy to measure. And most people have a pretty good handle on that these days. Scope 2 is a class of indirect emissions, and it's quite specific. It relates to the emissions associated with the generation of power that you purchase for your own use. It also relates to the emissions associated with the generation of heat or steam if you purchase those. So most of us purchase power. So again, in my day-to-day life, I do have Scope 2 emissions arising from the electricity that I use in my home, and most businesses have that in some form too. But if I lived in certain parts of Germany or other parts of Europe, I might be in district heating. So the emissions associated with the generation of that heat that is piped to my home would also be in there in my Scope 2. But it's usually quite specific. and it mostly covers power. That's most people's source of scope 2 is the power that they're using, that they're buying. Now, if you're a power trader and you're buying that power and selling it on, that's not in your scope 2, that sits in your scope 3, which is the other source of indirect emissions. So scope 3 is effectively everything else associated with the things that we do, particularly the goods and services that we buy and the goods and services that we sell. That's very, very broad, right? I mean, we all buy many businesses buy many raw materials, they buy many services associated with their activities, and all of that goes into their scope 3, and it can be very, as you can imagine, very difficult to measure because it all sits outside of their direct control, and often it's quite opaque. And the traceability through the value chain of the goods and services that they buy and sell can be quite tricky. So that's why scope 3 is such a challenge. But the Greenhouse Gas Protocol does its best to tell us how to measure it, how to calculate it, and how to get the data for it. So we'll go a bit deeper into scope 3 on the following slide and try and break it down into something a little bit more manageable. So how they actually categorize scope 3, because it's so broad, they break it into 15 different categories. And broadly split those between the 8 upstream categories and the 7 downstream categories. The upstream categories are mostly associated with goods and services that we buy. If I look at most organizations, probably the most material, certainly the companies that I deal with, I work with a lot of large natural resources businesses. Probably their biggest category of scope 3 emissions is associated with the goods and services that they buy. Right, they'll have other emissions such as employee commuting and business travel, but they're really quite small compared to some of the the emissions associated with the extraction and production of the raw materials that, say, an aluminium smelter buys to put through its process. So that varies really depending on the nature of your business, but you'll have some really material categories of emissions as a service business. For example, Baringa, we don't buy a lot of goods and services. We don't buy a lot of raw materials. However, our business travel is probably our biggest source of emissions when we have consultants flying all over the world. So varies a great deal depending on your business. But this helps us to actually break it into something a bit manageable when we try and measure these and estimate them. We can look at the different sources of emissions associated with goods and services that we buy and the goods and services that we sell. We can allocate them to specific categories. We can estimate the materiality of those, and then we can focus on the specific categories that really are the most relevant and the most emitting. If we jump onto the next slide, you can kind of get a sense of how this varies from industry to industry. The blue bar, the dark blue bar in these charts is downstream emissions, and the red bar is upstream scope 3 emissions. As you can see, in both cases, they tend to dwarf people's scope 1 and 2. So scope 3 emissions, I think Nandini mentioned earlier, are often about 11 times your average scope 1 and 2 emissions. And that's not surprising, really, when you think of the breadth of activities covered under your scope 3. Whether they fall into the upstream categories or the downstream categories really depends on the nature of your business. For an energy business, so when we talk about energy businesses in this context, like oil and gas companies, the vast majority of the emissions associated with their business are downstream. The extraction of oil and gas is a relatively high emitting activity, but nothing compared to the emissions associated with the combustion of those products when they sell them. So that would fall into scope 3 category 11, the use of sold products when they sell the refined products that they produce and they are burned. That makes up the vast majority of their scope 3. If I look down the list at sort of something like healthcare, the vast majority of the emissions associated with healthcare sit upstream, associated with mostly with the goods and services that they buy for use in hospitals and so on. So very different sources of emissions, very different emphasis in terms of the data gathering and the calculations required to estimate those scope 3, which translates into very different sets of targets and very different mitigation activities. So hopefully that gives you sort of a basic understanding of the different scopes of emissions, and particularly of scope 3. We will be sharing these slides afterwards so you can dig into the categories a little bit more and think about them in the context of your business. But that just gives you a sense of how people try and get to grips with this and break those emissions down into something a bit more manageable when they measure them. So I'll hand back to Evan now to talk you through how we actually go about calculating these.
Yeah, thanks you. And so this is the bit where we get really exciting. So we actually talk about the process that you'll go through in order to do these emissions. It's worth saying that we will include, and we have at the end, a list of resources. So this comes from a document that the ICI produced to help PE firms think about how they quantify their emissions and measure their emissions. So we'll be sending out a link to this as well. So I appreciate there's quite a lot of detail we'll go through in here. And also, if you have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A. We've got, as we mentioned at the beginning, we've got some time at the end to go through the Q&A. So the first of your sort of 5 steps for how you go about calculating your scope 3 emissions is to choose the reporting boundary. Your reporting boundary is going to align with your organizational structure. So when we're talking about this, we're thinking about, does your business have subsidiaries? Is it a single legal entity? Are you looking at multiple legal entities that all come up to a parent company? These are the questions that are all defined in the GHG protocol. And it's really important to go through and understand what is in your scope 1 and 2 versus your scope 3. And that's what you're doing when you're choosing your reporting boundary. And this is all, as we mentioned, defined in the GHG protocol. So once you understand your scope boundary, so you've said, okay, these are my scope 1 and 2 emissions, this is my scope 3, you then want to start going through and looking at what the sources of emissions are within your scope 3. You'll often see this referred to as a screening process. So this is about understanding what emissions you should look at in more detail and to include in your scope 3 emissions inventory. So then on the next slide, we go through some of the specific questions that are really useful to thinking about how do you classify and quantify the things that you ought to be thinking about when it comes to scope 3. So the first thing you might ask yourself is how much of your total scope 3 emissions are a specific supplier contributing? So do you have some companies that are contributing a lot to your scope 3 emissions, and you might want to prioritize those? The second question with that is around influence. How much influence do you have over that supplier? So for example, if you have Microsoft in your supply chain, you might be looking at Microsoft's emissions, but chances are that you as a smaller business aren't going to be able to knock on Microsoft's door and tell them to reduce their emissions. So you might want to think about the suppliers and partners and people you work with who you're able to exercise more control over and work together to start to think about your emissions. The next one is looking at who the stakeholders are. Who are the critical people who you're going to work with? And remember that when we're talking about scope 3 emissions, we're not only talking about suppliers, we're not only talking about people who come from your procurement teams. You could also be looking at your internal stakeholders. You could be looking at talking to people on your teams about reducing business travel, for example, or talking to product development teams about developing products that are going to generate less emissions downstream. So it's really important to think more holistically about who you might want to include and engage. The next is looking at a spend or revenue analysis. This can be a really important tool where you're looking at how much of your revenue is coming from specific suppliers, and therefore it can help you to prioritize. The next is looking at whether or not you want to prioritize certain suppliers in your value chain who are presenting the most risk. That's obviously something that you're going to want to be thinking about when it comes to prioritizing, and the higher risk emitters or higher risk sources of emissions are ones to bring forward. Next is looking at outsourcing. So this can be a really good question about how your business is actually running. So relating back to the point around defining operational boundaries, you might have some functions that you've outsourced to other companies that might in other circumstances have been part of your business. And some of those, even though they fall into scope 3, you might want to prioritize, even though it's other companies that are doing it. They might be so central to your operations that it's worth looking at their emissions as a priority. The third is looking at whether or not there's sector-specific guidance. This can be very helpful when you're setting your emissions target, particularly for sort of high-emitting sectors. There's a lot of guidance that's available. We've also, as I've mentioned, included some sector-specific guidance and tools as an appendix within this presentation, so you'll get links to that in the future when we send out these slides. And finally, there might be other criteria, guidance that you might want to consider that's relevant to your sector when you're prioritizing your Scope 3 activities. So once you've got that, so you've now understood your operational boundary, you've prioritized your emissions. Going on to the next slide, we're going to talk about collecting data. This is an extremely complicated task. We have an entire webinar dedicated to this. So it is our next webinar, next Wednesday. So there's a lot of nuance when it comes to actually collecting the data that you're going to want to report. But two key things to think about when you're collecting data are primary data and secondary data. Your primary data is real data that you've been able to gather from the activities within your value chain. Secondary data is where you're calculating data using industry averages. Right now, there is a lot of ambiguity, a lot of questions around Scope 3 emissions. So we're seeing lots of proxies, lots of secondary data being used. And that is perfectly fine. That is what's going to be happening. And this is a journey for all businesses to go on as we become better and more familiar with calculating Scope 3 emissions. So doing to the best of your ability, collect the data that you need. Once you've got that data, you find an emissions factor. An emissions factor is something you're able to pull from a table. So you look at specific activities, and those specific activities will have an emissions factor. And that emissions factor might be something that's often in sort of GHG, carbon equivalent. So you're able to quite easily work out what the emissions are from those activities, which brings us to the final stage, which is about calculating your emissions. It is actually a very straightforward process to calculate your emissions. It's a very simple mathematical formula. The challenge, though, is that when you're doing that calculation, there's actually a lot of work that goes into this. So this 5-step process is a vast simplification. We've worked with clients for a really long time, for months, sometimes even years, to be able to understand the full spectrum of their Scope 3 emissions. So whilst you're building up to a really simple mathematical formula, there is a lot of work that's involved in going through these steps. Once you've done that, and once you've calculated your emissions, what a lot of companies are now starting to think about is moving on to setting a Scope 3 target. The Science-Based Target Initiative has created tools, a methodology, and a framework that goes through and helps you to set targets. Again, we have a webinar, so our third webinar in the series looks specifically at emission reduction targets. But with that, I'm going to pass over to Paolo, who's going to talk about his experience calculating emissions, going through that process, and ultimately setting a Scope 3 reduction target. So over to you, Paolo.
Yep. Hello, everyone. A couple of words on my company before to start. Wella Closure is the worldwide leader for closure for spirits and for aluminum closure for wine and water. Today, I will speak about our journey to understand the composition of our Scope 3 and how we define our targets. Next slide, please. I'll start showing where we are with the validation of our target by Science-Based Target Initiative. It has been a challenging path, but we did it. In May last year, we started with the commitment. In July, we submitted our targets. And in December, after different meetings, it was not an easy journey, but with Science-Based Target Initiative discussion, we had the approval of our targets. So we are now in this situation. Next slide. So our commitment is to reduce Scope 1 and Scope 2 absolute emission 44% by 2030 from a 2020 base year. And also, Wella made a commitment to reduce Scope 3 GHG emission from purchased goods and services and full energy related activities per million of finished closure 25% by 2030. Thanks. Next slide. Before to show you how we arrived to this commitment, I will give you an overview about Scope 3. As we have seen in the slide before, the scope 3 between the emission is the biggest one. So it can be up to 90%, 95% of the emission of one company. But also it's the most difficult one to calculate. If you see that only 18% of companies report on scope 3. What was the situation in wall closure? In 2020, our scope 3 was around 80%. Our scope 2 was around 15%. Our scope 1 was around 5%. Next slide. When we did the screening in 2020 about our scope 3 composition, we discovered that with 4 categories, we had 86% of the scope 3 emission. These 4 categories are purchased goods and services that represent 75% of our emission. Fuel and energy-related activities is around 4%. Transportation, upstream and downstream, that is another 7%. The remaining 11 categories represented only the 14%. Based on this data, we decided to do an inventory every year of these categories, and also we add the category 5, waste generating operation. This is not a big category for us because only less than 1%, but it's really important because we want to keep this value under control. Next slide, please. How we did this inventory? We developed an internal tool where all the plants, we have 29 plants, put the data inside. After we have a consultant that put the related emission factor of all this material, transport, and so on inside the tool. These emission factor are calculated using SIMAPRO software and industrial data database. And after with the tool, we can process the data, have a report on scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. A report that is in compliance with the GHG protocol. Next slide, please. We didn't stop. In order to verify the compliance with the GHG protocol, we decided to have a certification of our emission every year. So every year we do the certification of our emission. In this year, for example, in February 2023, we did the certification of the 2022 emission of water closure. Next slide, please. So having a clear understanding of our scope 3 emission, we worked to define our targets. SBTi gives 4 ways to define the target on scope 3. The first one was the absolute one. For us, it's not the right one because we increased our production over the years, and we want to continue to do it. So it's not the right approach for us because we are going. It's difficult for us to decrease in absolute way. As a packaging producer, we don't have a sectorial decarbonisation framework, so we can't use this approach. And also, we checked with our supplier if there was somebody that's already working with Science-Based Target Initiative, and no one started. So it was impossible for us also to use the supplier engagement method. So we choose the intensity method. We had 2 choices, to have an intensity on the weight of the product or on the quantity of the product. In our case, we considered that for us, the trend of the market is to have lighter product. So for us, it's more convenient to have an intensity based on quantity. So we did it, and we develop a target on the intensity on the quantity produced. Next slide, please. So science-based target asks also to have a target that covers at least 2/3 of our emission. So we had 2 choices, the categories where to put our target. We choose 2 categories, purchase goods and services and fuel and energy related activities that covers around 79% of our emission. Because we have seen, based on our simulation, that we have a lot of potential improvement on these 2 categories. For example, if we look at the category 1, 90% of the category 1 is represented by the 2 materials we use for our product, the aluminum and the plastic. To give you an example, the aluminum change a lot where we buy it. If the aluminum is produced in China, we have an average emission factor of 28 kilograms per kilogram of aluminum. If it is produced in Europe, it's completely different because we have 9 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of aluminum. So we have seen that changing the way we purchase the aluminum, we can do a lot. And also the recycled part. The recycled aluminum has 95% less emission than the primary aluminum. So also working on the recycled part of the aluminum we put in our closure, we can change a lot. For the fuel and energy related activities is also an important point, because in our strategy to reduce scope 1 and scope 2, we want to arrive to 80% of purchased electricity from renewable sources. Doing this, we can have also a good improvement of this category in scope 3. Next slide, please. So the last slide is the evolution of the scope 3 category 1 and 3 in our product, considering all the things that I said before. So working on the energy, so going to 80% of renewable energy, we can have a decrease of 2.5% of our scope 3 emission intensity. Working on plastic, that we have to change recycled plastic instead of virgin plastic in component on contact with food, we can have another 2.3% of decrease, but the big part is the aluminum. If we switch to low carbon country, the purchase of aluminum, we can have up to 90% of purchase from low carbon country, or increase the recycling content up to 60%, we can have a decrease of 20% of our scope 3. So combining these three strategies, we have the 25% that is the value we committed to. So thank you. I'll give you the speech back.
Thanks, Paolo. That was really useful. Yeah, thank you very much. It's really useful to see all those pieces coming together and all the great work that you've done. So I think we've seen a couple of questions have come through on the Q&A. I appreciate the fact that I think that no one can actually speak. I think that everyone has by default become muted. So I think we've got people. Could someone read out some of the questions we've got? And please, I think that if you have more questions, we've got time. So please pop your questions into the Q&A. What's the first question for us to discuss?
So Evan, yeah, we've got a question on the software solutions that aid with monitoring and measuring, reporting, and carbon emissions. I think that we'll cover that in one of the later workshops.
We do go into that in the next workshop. We talk about some of the data providers. So good plug for the workshop that's next week. But I don't know if anyone else has a particular view on some of the data providers we've used or we've got any experience with. I can talk a little bit about kind of my perspective.
Yeah, I can give a little bit of a perspective too, Evan. I suppose I would break it down between there's data providers, and there's obviously people who provide solutions that help you calculate emissions, and there's people who do a bit of both, right? So you can buy software that helps you do the calculations and pull data in from your systems and elsewhere to do the calculations, or you can enter it manually. And some of those pieces of software also contain databases of emissions factors and so on that allow you to calculate your emissions. We've looked at it. We've built those for people. We've also helped people select them. And what I find is, they vary quite a lot in nature and applicability to different businesses. As I mentioned earlier, we work a lot with large natural resources producers and traders, the oil super majors, some of the really big mining companies and trading companies. We find that a lot of those solutions are not really up to the task of measuring the scope 3 emissions up and down these very complex and often quite opaque commodity value chains, especially not for the really big high volume trading businesses. Whereas, if you were a small manufacturing business, some of those off the shelf products can be absolutely all you need. You plug in some fairly basic data, you connect it with your fairly simple inventory management systems and enterprise resource planning systems, and away you go. So it really does vary in terms of, what size of sledgehammer you need to crack your particular nut.
Yeah, I guess that's similar. I think what we've seen with some of our clients, some of our smaller clients who have been able to use these off-the-shelf tools that use AI have been very, very effective. But as soon as you start to introduce more nuance and more complexity into your business model, sometimes those off-the-shelf solutions need a bit of tweaking and a bit of tailoring, and you often need to bring in, or sometimes the suppliers we'll have consultants who can help you tweak what the AI is doing, because not many businesses fit straight into that sort of standard box. Next question.
So there's a number of questions around sort of how to start and calculation methodologies and the variation that seems to that there seems to be. Can we say a little bit about sort of approaches and confidence once you've gone through the process?
I think maybe is it worth, Paolo, if you talk a little bit about kind of the process that you went through and make it a live example, and then we can bring in some of the example of some of the clients that we've worked with.
In our case, we started the screening so with an external consultant. So at the beginning, we started with an external consultant for sure. And after, we developed a tool internally, because as we've seen that 4 categories were the most important one, and they were not so difficult to keep under control, because raw material at the end is quite easy to keep under control. The transportation is more difficult. We have to trace every truck we organize and so on, but in any case, it's something that we can keep under control. Then related activities is quite easy, because it's related to the energy you buy, the purchase from electrical energy, so it's something that's easy. So the 4 categories are not so difficult to keep under control. There are a lot of data, because I was saying plastic, but plastic is not only one plastic. We have a lot of different plastic with different related emissions, but as you start at the end, it's not too difficult. It's a database, you put the data, there is a database with the related emission factor, and so you can have the data quite easily. But it depends on the activity. In our activity, in this case, I think in some other activity, maybe it's more difficult, but in our case, it's quite easy. The thing is that after you have to use maybe not industrial data average, but you try to do better. So if you try to have with the different supplier, a different emission. So this is something that we are developing in the year. This is something that allowed us to develop the target. So we know that if we choose one supplier, we have a worse or better performance in terms of emission.
I think one thing that I might add, before you even really start thinking about going into the nitty-gritty of calculating the emissions, what's really important is to get the business on board and explain the journey that you're about to go through. Because fundamentally, in order to decarbonize your Scope 3 emissions, everyone in the business needs to be involved. It really has a lot of touch points. And if it's something that just a sustainability team is trying to do, I think that you're setting off for failure. What you need to do is explain, get the senior level buy-in and support to transform the organization enough to go on this journey. And I think I'd always recommend that as really the first starting point.
I completely agree. So if you don't have the commitment of the top management, it's difficult to go on. So I'm lucky, because Guala started in 2011 with the first program. So we are quite. It's not new for us. So we started a long time ago. So for us now, it's easier to go on.
Yeah, just to add to that, Evan, I think as you go through that process of engaging with the wider business to get their buy-in, we also encourage clients to think about use cases for emissions data beyond just what you put in your sustainability report, for example. Some of our clients, pretty rapidly identified, well, they want to be able to footprint some of their products, right? So that they can differentiate some products, because they felt their emissions profile was probably lower than some of their competitors, and actually gain some commercial competitive advantage from this, which is rightly so, right? That's actually a good thing. As the market develops and people start to identify those greener products, that's going to drive behaviors in the right direction. So in some cases, there are specific use cases for emissions data in your business beyond just measuring those emissions for the purposes of decarbonisation, but also to gain other benefit. And those use cases will determine the degree of accuracy and granularity you need to achieve in your emissions measurement doing product carbon footprinting requires a higher degree of accuracy than some other measurement. So that kind of starts to help you decide, okay, when we do go to do this work, how do we need to, specify our methodology to achieve that? Whether it's just kind of high-level top-down estimates or really bottom-up granular measurement. So that's one of the key steps we try and take at the beginning.
Thanks, thanks, guys. A question for Paolo. A couple of questions actually. One was, what's in terms of the commercial aspects? How did you get the business on board with the commercial aspects of that? How did you develop a business case and take the business along with you when you were setting out to do this? And also, there's a specific one about SBTI. Once they started verifying your targets, how did that work for you? So maybe talk about the commercial aspects, because I'm sure there's a lot of people interested in that one.
For the first question, it was not difficult because now our customers are asking for targets, for a commitment. So it's not always you have to pay more or spend more. So the solution we are thinking about are not more cost. So we are thinking about to change maybe the plastic in not contact food components with recycled plastic. So maybe the cost will be the same and maybe the future will be less. Change the aluminum is not always to have to pay more. It's something that we have to develop with the purchasing department. It's not for sure an increase of cost. So from the commercial aspect, I think to having them on board it's quite easy. If you don't increase the cost, you have a benefit on the environmental point of view. It's quite easy to have this commercial message to give. I think we are all on board. But there will be some cases where the cost will be higher. We will check them and we will see what to do with the customer. If they are really involved and committed to sustainability, maybe they are okay to pay a little bit more. It's something to see case by case. About the Science-Based Target Initiative, it was really a journey with them because we sent to them our commitment, all the paper they wanted, and after they came to us with some little things to adjust because they didn't agree about something. Sometimes we had to accept, but it was really small. So at the end, also this one, we had a company that helped us, so we didn't do only by ourselves, but it was something that we did. I think it was difficult, but was not impossible. So it's something that if you have the inventory and the screening done very well, you can go and apply to the science-based target without any problem. The things that you need to have is the screening and the inventory done very well.
Great, thanks, Paolo. I think that what we're seeing with our clients at Baringa is that this access to markets is a really important point, which is driving Scope 3. And where most portfolio companies are in the value chain, the end markets, the tier 1 corporates and even governments are looking to drive net zero commitments down their supply chain. And so I've got no doubt that most of you on the call will be getting questionnaires from your clients and from your customers asking what you're doing around basically your carbon emissions and whether you've got plans to decarbonize. And if you're not seeing them already, you will start to see them because that seems to be the end commitment if we're going to meet our Paris goals. So I think that the access to markets and are you contributing and helping the end market, the tier 1 corporates or the governments achieve their objective is going to be critical in terms of your accessing those market areas. So I think that's another really powerful business reason to start measuring and mitigating your Scope 3. There's a couple more questions that we've got a few more minutes. So globally recognized certification around carbon footprinting. How do we get confidence in Scope 3 footprinting? I'm not sure that there is a certification kind of methodology at the moment. I think we're all sort of learning. We've got more confidence in scope 1 and scope 2. Scope 3 is still very much a nascent area that we're all learning and growing on. Evan, Hugh, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
In our case, we do the certification by a third party that check that we are using in the right way the GHG protocol. So the data we put in our paper, in our report of sustainability are correct and calculated in the right way. After they don't check for sure the single data, but they check the methodology. To give you another example, we are working to develop an internal tool also to calculate the environmental product declaration. So going also on this way to have something that is certified also on this way. For me, I agree with you. It's really a competitive advantage to have this instrument or this data certified, and you can give your customer your carbon footprint, your environmental product declaration. For me is the challenge. If we are like this, it's winning. So.
That's yeah, we see that quite a lot, Paolo, in terms of the having people verify, independent experts verify methodology. We see sort of two types of verification. One is people verifying that the methodology is broadly in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. One of the issues there is, particularly around scope 3, there are a lot of different potential interpretations, and so there's a lot of gray areas. So it's not always guaranteed that they're doing it the way you might be doing it, that somebody else is doing exactly the same way. But certainly increasingly,
it's better than nothing. So
but as you say, it's better than nothing, and it helps if at least somebody independent has looked at it and said, okay, you're doing it on this basis, and that makes reasonable sense, and that's a reasonable interpretation of the protocol for your business. That's number one. You also do get, the classic audit firms auditing the numbers, and they will not necessarily audit the methodology, that audit that you have adhered to your stated methodology, and that you've calculated the numbers correctly on that basis. And that's much more similar to just financial accounting audits that you sort of see. For some things, there are other standards as well. So particularly for product carbon footprinting. So if you're buying something and they are putting a product carbon footprint on it, sometimes they'll use some of the life cycle analysis standards. And there are ISO standards around life cycle analysis that dictate not just how you measure emissions, but also how you take all of those emissions through the process of creating a product and attribute them to the particular products coming out the end. So if you're running a factory that produces lots of different stuff, how have you divided up those emissions and attributed them to the products in a fair way, rather than sort of gaming it by, claiming something is zero emissions and something else gets all of the emissions. So there are some ISO standards around that as well that people follow and will often cite when they provide a product carbon footprint.
Great, thanks, Hugh. That was helpful. One other question, which I think we'll pick up later, but what about markets that are really underdeveloped in terms of this data? So you've got a very broad supply chain, and you're getting companies, you're asking companies for data in markets which really have got a very underdeveloped. Any thoughts or guidance on that?
This goes into sort of talking about that kind of primary versus secondary data, and appreciating that this is a journey that we're all going on, and using proxies or estimating what the data is for now is what companies in these markets where real data is not available are just doing. And ultimately, over the years, data will get better, and you'll be able to improve your reporting in the future. I think it's better to start and use proxies and be closer than to just ignore it and not do anything, would be I think what we're seeing.
Yeah, we do see, there's a whole plethora of companies now emerging who are trying to fill this gap. In the natural resources space, in particular around certain metals and indeed oil products, we see some of the big traditional data providers, the Wood Mackenzie's, CRU, who traditionally used to provide sort of cost data for different mines and different oil fields and that kind of thing, also now providing independent views of the emissions associated, the emissions intensity of different assets. So if you're buying copper from a particular mine, there are companies who will actually have databases and they will give you their estimate of the emissions intensity of that mine versus other mines. So that's it's emerging. It's still new. The quality of that data definitely varies by provider, but there are increasingly databases out there that you can buy. You can subscribe to fill those gaps where your suppliers either can't or aren't quite ready to share that information themselves.
We see with the aluminium that now we're starting to receive LCA verified with from the different suppliers. So 2 years ago it was impossible, no idea of LCA. So only average data. Now we have different data, so I think it's something that is moving faster.
Yeah, moving very, very quickly.
Yes.
So yeah, I would recommend if you are struggling for data and you can't get it from your supplier, do look at third parties. There are increasingly, other people out there trying to provide it.
So a bit of a blue sky gazing to finish off. When will, if ever, Scope 4 emissions be included in the GHG carbon footprint calculation?
I'm not sure, and I'm not sure I want them to be. I see lots of opportunity for fiddling the numbers with Scope 4. Don't know about the other people on the call, but I don't see it anytime soon.
Yeah. My view is that I think there's probably a bit too much scope to be able to negate to not have quite enough control over the way that it's working before I think the GHG protocol would be comfortable recommending companies start to include Scope 4 without wiggling out of their real world decarbonization.
I think one of the challenges with it, Evan, is, once you start to talk about Scope 4, you start to bring in kind of external hypotheticals, right? And you start to say, if I hadn't done this, somebody else would have done that. And as you can imagine, that leaves it really ripe for kind of greenwashing. I think there's enough skepticism around the data at the moment that the last thing we need is to muddy the waters even further. With Scope 4, that's why I'd much rather we got much better at reporting Scope 3 before we got into that area.
Great. I think we are now exactly at time. So thank you to everyone for joining. As we've mentioned a couple of times throughout the webinar, we've got another webinar coming up that's looking at data collection. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Paulo, for taking us through your real example, which was really useful. And thank you to everyone, and thanks to the ICI for organizing this.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.